Okay, so we're going to learn about the biological basis of behavior. Okay, now see, we call this subject with different names: biological basis of the behavior, physiological basis of the behavior, biopsychology, behavioral neuroscience, etc. These names are correct. Okay, so now the definition of biopsychology: a branch of neuroscience that focuses on the biological basis of psychological processes. Okay, this is very important. Biological basis of psychological processes, behavior and learning. Okay, uh, except behavior and learning, what are all the psychological processes like emotions, motivations, cognition, problem solving, decision making? These are all come under psychological processes only. But there is an important point to note here: biopsychology is the study of biological basis of psychological processes, but psychobiology is the study of psychological basis for the biological processes. So these both are different. Okay, we cannot use this interchangeably. Okay, now, so the overview of our course: these are the basics. What is neuron and its parts? Neural impulse, the process of how the impulse is being generated in a neuron, and etc. And the third one is neurotransmission, how the communication between neurons happens, and what are the different neurotransmitters. There is a biggest difference between neural impulse and neurotransmission, and most of the students gets confused here. The difference is neural impulse happens within a single neuron, whereas neurotransmission happens between minimum of two neurons. Okay, then we are going to start about nervous system, which is the combination of central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is nothing but the brain and spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system is a combination of lot many nervous systems, which we will learn further. And at last we will learn about endocrine system, which is nothing but our glands and the hormones and all. Okay, okay. Now, what is a neuron? Neuron is a specialized cell in the nervous system that receives and sends messages within the system. Okay, so within the nervous system is nothing but the brain, the spinal cord, and the remaining peripheral nervous system, whatever is there, we will get to know. So this is the basic unit of the entire nervous system. So what is the basic unit of human body? Cell. Okay. Similarly, the basic unit for a nervous system is neuron, and neuron has different parts: dendrite, soma or cell body, axon hillock, axon, nodes of Ranvier, myelin sheath, and axon terminal, etc. Okay, these are the most important parts. Now we'll see one by one. First one, dendrites. So these branch like structures are called dendrites. Okay, what these will do, they receive signals from other cells. Okay, this is their only function. Now the second one is cell body. Cell body is nothing but organization keeps the cell functional, which means it produces the nutrients, whatever the required nutrients for a neuron to function. Okay, now in between the cell body, like in the middle of the cell body, there is nucleus, which controls almost everything. The mitochondria and all is present in the nucleus, and it controls the entire neuron. Okay, which is like the heart of the nucleus. Okay, heart of the neuron. Okay, now cell membrane, you already know, that protects the cell. Axon hillock, we will study this axon hillock separately when we are studying the neural impulse part. Okay, it generates impulse in the neuron. We'll get to know. Wait. Okay, now nodes of Ranvier. Nodes of Ranvier is nothing but these gaps are there. No, see this blue color wala this blue color wala things are myelin sheath, and the and the gaps between them are nodes of Ranvier. These nodes of Ranvier fastens the process of neural impulse. Okay, here the definition is it allows diffusion of ions, but basically the function of the nodes of Ranvier is to fasten the process of neural impulse. Okay, now there is something called Schwann cell. We will get to know this also when we are studying about glial cells and all. Which Schwann cell helps in producing the myelin sheath. Okay, next. Now axon. Axon is like the stem of a tree. So Similarly, this action is to the neuron. Okay, transfer signals to other cells and organs. Okay, see, whatever the signal is received through dendrites, it will transfer through axon and then to the axon terminal, which forms junctions with the other cells. Okay, now a neuron receives signal here in dendrites and it transfers through the axon, and then it transmits that information through axon terminal to other neurons. Okay, this is the basic functions of a neuron and its parts. Okay, now the coming to the one of the most important parts again. Neurons are not the only cells responsible for our cognitive activities and behavior. See, again, neurons are not the only cells responsible for our cognitive activities and behavior. Other primary cells called glial cells also plays an important role. So what are these glial cells? Come. See, glial cells does provide support for neurons to grow. मतलब whatever the nutrients required, whatever the support material that is required for a neuron to grow, the glial cells will provide. It will help maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is nothing but a balanced state. Like whenever a neuron gets excited, the glial cells will help to bring them back to the neutral state. Okay. Next, this is also called, these cells are also called partner cells for neuron, and similarly supply nutrients to neurons. We are already studied. Cleanse the remains of dead neurons. Okay, and insulates axons of some neurons. Okay, this is also one of the most important point, because uh, for whatever the axon that is being insulated by a glial cell, the impulse generated in that neuron is much faster than in a neuron for which the axons are not insulated. Okay, so glial cells help in that. And second thing, communicating with other neurons and glial cells, which is a similar action of a typical neuron, and influence growth of new neurons during prenatal development. Prenatal development matlab, when the fertilized egg is in the womb, or when the child is in mother's womb, that is called prenatal period and prenatal development, and these glial cells influence growth of new neurons during that period. Now there are two types of glial cells. First one is oligodendrocytes and the second one is Schwann cells. First one, oligodendrocytes generates myelin for neurons in brain and spinal cord only. This is very important. Okay, these type of glial cells only generate myelin for neurons in brain and spinal cord, whereas Schwann cells generates myelin for neurons in body only, matlab peripheral nervous system. And why am I referring to the peripheral nervous system as body? You will get to know when we read about the nervous system in detail. Okay, now these oligodendrocytes does not have self-repair feature, and that's why any injury caused to the brain or spinal cord will be permanent, whereas the Schwann cells have self-repair feature, and that is why whenever a hand is cut, whenever there is an injury happens on our leg or hand, we will again get the sense of touch or something naturally. Okay, now these myelin coded axons in CNS are called as tracts, whereas the same myelin coated axons in PNS are called as nerves. Okay, this is the basic difference between oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells, which are both are two types of glial cells. Now coming to neural impulse. This is different from neural transmission, as I have already told you, and neural impulse happens within the neuron. There are three steps in neural impulse, which are nothing but resting potential, action potential, and reset. Okay, done. Now first step, when a neuron is in rest, imagine this is inside of the neuron. Okay, there are positive potassium ions and negative protein ions, but these negative protein ions are larger in size when compared to positive potassium ions, and that is why inside of a neuron is negatively charged at rest. Okay, this is at rest. Similarly, this is outside. Okay, in the outside of the neuron there are positive sodium ions and negative chloride ions, but although they are similar in size, there are more sodium ions when compared to negative chloride ions. So this is why outside of neuron is positively charged, and this is at rest too. Okay, see once again. Now we have already studied inside of the neuron is negatively charged and the outside of the neuron is positively charged. This difference in charges creates an electrical potential, which is nothing but the resting potential. Okay, this is nothing but the first step in a neural impulse, resting potential. Now, when the cell receives strong enough signal or stimulus from another cell, the cell membrane opens those particular channels through which sodium ions can enter into the cell. See, here there are sodium ions. Now at resting potential, these cannot enter into inside. But when as soon as that cell receives strong enough signal or stimulus from another cell, this cell membrane, whatever this cell membrane is there, it opens those particular channels through which sodium ions can enter into the cell. And once those sodium ions enters into the cell, the inside of the cell becomes positive and the outside of the cell becomes negative. See, now since most of the sodium ions entered the cell, the charge of the cell becomes positive. Inside of the cell becomes positive. This reversal of the charge is known as action potential. Now I have already told you we will study about action hillock when we study about neural impulse. So this action potential starts at the action hillock primarily. The first impulse is generated at action hillock. Okay, that is the importance of the action hillock part. Okay, now so the resting potential is done and the action potential is also done. Now what after that? Steps after action potential. So we have already known that sodium ions entered into inside. So as soon as they come inside, the sodium ion channels will close. Potassium ions will move outside. See, we all know that our complete body tries to maintain homeostasis, a balance. If we see here, the cell is initially negative in charge at resting potential, but since most of the positive sodium ions came inside, the cell becomes positively charged in the inside at action potential. Since most of the sodium ions came inside, the potassium ions are there. No, these potassium ions will try to go out to bring the cell back to the negatively charged as initially it was. Okay, so in this period, the whatever the charge that is there inside of the neuron will drop a little bit lesser than its initial charge, which is nothing but hyperpolarization. So this state of neuron where the charge inside of the neuron drops less than its original resting position is called hyperpolarization. Once this step is done, then all the potassium ions come inside again and sodium ions goes outside, which is nothing but the reset state. Now when this reset happens, the entire neuron is ready to fire again. Okay, so this is how the neural impulse process happens. Initially it is negative in charge in the inside of the cell and the outside of the neuron is positive, and whenever the in the action potential state, since most of the sodium ions come inside of the cell will become positive, and to maintain the negative state inside, the potassium ions will go outside. Okay, so when they go out, there is a brief movement called hyperpolarization, and after that hyperpolarization, then the neuron resets itself again, which means potassium ions again come inside and sodium ions again goes outside, and the neuron is ready to fire again. And there are some important points related to neural impulse, which are nothing but neurons work in all or none manner. Okay, so, which means neurons have a particular threshold, and when a stimulus is strong enough to cross that threshold, the neuron fires in its complete manner, which means there is no partial firing. But there is sometimes called strong stimulation and weak stimulation, which means neuron is fired repeatedly at the same strength but slowly for a weak stimulation. But there is nothing called partial firing. Either you feel the stimulus entirely or at nothing, but a strong stimulus means a neuron is being fired repeatedly, okay, at same strength, right? Now you have learnt about neural impulse. Now we will learn about neurotransmission process, okay. Now what is neurotransmission process? It happens between neurons. Neural impulse is within the neurons, but neurotransmission is between the neurons, okay. Now how these neurons communicate with each other is nothing but called neurotransmission process. Now there are certain important parts in neurotransmission. First one, presynaptic terminal. What is this presynaptic terminal? For suppose there is an axon, neuron number 1 and neuron number 2. Now the information is being passed from neuron number 1 to neuron number 2. Whatever the axon terminals that are there in neuron number 1, we have learnt in neuron parts, no, whatever those axon terminals are there, those are called as presynaptic terminals. And there will be a small gap, as you can see here, there will be a small gap between neuron number 1 and neuron number 2. This is nothing but called synapse, okay. Now there is postsynaptic terminal, which are nothing but called dendrites of the second neuron. This is also called as receptor site, okay. Now the process, we will learn the process now. See, this is the neuron number 1, okay, and this is neuron number 2. Now these are axon terminals, okay, and this is synapse, and this is post synaptic receptor or site. Now in this presynaptic terminal there are something called vesicle, which are also called as sacs, sacs or bags. These contain neurotransmitters which are mainly responsible for neurotransmission process, okay. Now whenever a signal is received at this presynaptic terminal, that neuron will release those neurotransmitters into synapse, okay. Now this second neuron's receptor site will receive those neurotransmitters which will fit into particular receptor sites only. This is the basic process of neurotransmission. And see, when action potential reaches the end, the synaptic vessels releases neurotransmitters into synaptic gap. These fit into the receptor sites of other neuron. This opens ion channels for sodium, thus activating the next cell. See, what does this opening of ion channels for sodium means? In neural impulse, we learnt that the action potential starts from opening of ion channels for sodium, which means they enter inside and the potassium ions goes outside and all, okay. So this is what is meant by opening of ion channels for sodium. Now the most important point is, next cell could be a neuron, a muscle or a gland, okay. This is the most important part. Now synapses can also occur on the soma of the postsynaptic cell, as the surface membrane of the soma also has receptor sites, which means the second, the neurotransmission need not occur only on the dendrites of the second neuron, it can also occur on the soma of the second neuron, okay. Now see, after this neurotransmission happens, there are two processes which are called reuptake and enzymatic degradation. Either one can happen or either both can happen simultaneously, okay. Now reuptake is nothing but process by which neurotransmitters are taken back into the synaptic vesicles, whereas enzymatic degradation is the faster process by which the structure of a neurotransmitter is altered, so it can no longer act on a receptor, okay. This is a quick alternative. Now these are usually happens in the case of endorphins, okay, in painkillers and all. Done. Now we have learnt about neurotransmission, right? And there are some basic neurotransmitters which we need to learn about and their functions. Now the first one is acetylcholine, which this is also sometimes referred to as ACH, okay, ACH. This is mainly responsible for arousal, attention, memory, and muscle contractions. Okay. Now there is something called norepinephrine. This is mainly responsible for arousal and mood only. Now there is called dopamine. See, usually we refer dopamine to as happy hormone, but the majority of the dopamine is mostly responsible for control of movement, because for suppose dopamine is lacking or dopamine is not releasing in sufficient amounts in certain human beings, they will get this disease called Parkinson's disease, in which their movements are restricted. So dopamine is very important in control of movements also. Okay, then there is obviously sensations of pleasure, which is why it is also called as happy hormone. Now there is serotonin, which is mostly responsible for sleep, mood, anxiety, and appetite. The people who are in depressed state usually have the imbalance between the serotonin and dopamine levels, and that is why most doctors prescribe serotonin inhibitors, reuptake inhibitors, so that serotonin can act for most of the time in the receptor sites, and they can have those sleep, mood, anxiety, and appetite in balance. Okay. Now there is another hormone called GABA, which is related to sleep and inhibits movement, and there is something called glutamate, which is related to learning, memory formation, nervous system development, and etc. And there is this endorphins are also most important in pain relief. These are usually called as natural pain relievers. Okay. And one interesting fact in regarding to endorphins is the people who run for a hobby, like there are two types of people in this world: the people who uh, the people who get endorphins while running, and the people who don't. See, the people who get endorphins while running will get addicted to running, because they'll get this sensation of pleasure by eliminating pain. So, and there are people who don't get those endorphins while running, and there are studies that have shown that endorphins are will be released while doing not only this running and all, while doing the activities that we love. It could be reading book, it could be watching a series, or it could be eating our food and all, or it could be anything that we love. Okay. uh, Now, and there are some important points related to these neurotransmitters. The first thing is neurotransmitter can either turn cells on or off. For suppose dopamine is being released from first neuron to second neuron. Dopamine is usually excitatory, because uh, it switches the second neuron on. So that is why those dopamine neurotransmitters are usually called excitatory neurotransmitters. And there is, for example, if you take endorphins, these endorphins will usually switches the second neuron off, and that is why those neurotransmitters are called inhibitor. But there is an important point to be noted, which is nothing but it is not the neurotransmitter itself that is excitator or inhibitory, but it is the effect of that neurotransmitters that is either excitator or inhibitor at that particular synapse. Okay, this is the most important point. Okay, the same definition I am explaining here once again. Excitatory synapse is nothing but a synapse at which a neurotransmitter causes the receiving cell to fire, whereas inhibitory synapse is nothing but a synapse at which a neurotransmitter causes the receiving cell to stop firing. Now, there are two more agonist and antagonist, which are mostly related to psychopharmacology subject, which is nothing but agonist is nothing but a chemical substance that mimics or enhances the effect of a particular neurotransmitter, whereas an antagonist a chemical substance that blocks or reduces the effects of neurotransmitter. But here a very important explanation will be there. For suppose if we take dopamine, a dopamine is usually acts as excitatory. Now whenever an agonist drug similar to dopamine is used, it will improve that excitation of the dopamine. Similarly, for suppose there is an endorphin, and whenever there is an agonist, there is a drug that is similar to dopamine, endorphin, which acts as an agonist, will act as inhibitory only. I am explaining once again. See, there is dopamine. The dopamine is usually excitatory, and you use a drug similar to dopamine which also excites the other neuron, then you call it as agonist. But for suppose there is an endorphin and you use a similar drug like endorphin which is inhibitory in nature, because the endorphin is also inhibitory in nature because it kills the pain and they are called as natural pain relievers, then also it is called as agonist only. Only if a drug is blocking or reducing the effects of that neurotransmitter, then it is called as antagonist, which means in simple words, if a drug is doing the same action as the particular neurotransmitter, that is called as friend, agonist. Whereas a drug is doing an opposite action of a neurotransmitter, that is called as enemy, which is nothing but antagonist. Okay. So this is everything related to neuron and its parts, neural impulse and neurotransmission process, and we have also learnt about some of the neurotransmitters. Okay. Now we will study about nervous system in detail. See, this is the basic flowchart of nervous system. Nervous system consists of central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. CNS is very simple. It consists of brain and spinal cord. We will study in detail about brain, but this is the basic overlay of CNS. Whereas PNS is a little bit complicated than CNS, in which there is an autonomic and somatic nervous systems. Again, in autonomic, there is sympathetic and parasympathetic, and in somatic there are sensory pathways and motor pathways. But there is nothing to get confused here. They are very simple. The PNS is extremely simple, although the flowchart may look complicated, but the PNS is extremely simple. But in CNS we need to study the brain in detail. Okay. Now let's study about brain. Now there are majorly three portions of brain. The first one is forebrain, the second one is midbrain, which is a very small part of the brain, and there is some the third portion is called hindbrain. Okay, here you can see this is called, the violet purple color is completely the forebrain, and there is the blue color hindbrain, and this little part is called midbrain. Okay. Now again in forebrain there are two classifications. One is the cortex and the second one is limbic system. In cortex there are cerebral hemispheres and there are two association areas we will get to know, and the limbic system is again classified accordingly. Okay, there is nothing to get confused here, it will be simple only. Now first we will study about hemispheres. See, there are two hemispheres, right? The right and the left. These two hemispheres are divided into lobes. Now, cerebral hemispheres. Cerebral hemispheres are nothing but cerebrum, and the corpus callosum is nothing but a tract on in brain which connects two hemispheres. Okay, and usually these cerebral hemispheres are arranged in contralateral organization, which is nothing but whatever your right side uh, functions are there, the right hand, the left hand, sorry, the right hand, the right leg and all, these are usually controlled by the left hemisphere of the brain, whereas the left side hand or leg controls are usually controlled by the right side of the brain. Opposite hemisphere is responsible for the other side of the body's actions. This is nothing but called contralateral organization. Okay. Now there are two important points. The hearing and vision goes to both sides. Okay, the processing of hearing and vision goes to both sides, whereas the taste and smell goes to only one side, which is ipsilateral function, and hearing and vision, this is nothing but called bilateral function. Okay. Now coming to cerebrum. Cerebrum is usually divided into four lobes. The first one is frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe and temporal lobe. Okay. Now coming to occipital lobe. which is nothing but the name itself says it usually uh, is responsible for vision, processes visual information in primary visual cortex. Okay, it also has visual association cortex, which is nothing but it takes in the information from other lobes and other parts of the brain also, which is related to vision, and makes the meaning out of it. See, has its parts in other lobes also, so that we can make meaning of the sensory information. Sensory matlab vision, whatever the visual information is there. Okay, now coming to parietal lobe. Parietal lobe nothing but it contains somatosensory cortex, which means it processes information from skin and internal body receptors, for example the touch, temperature and body position. Okay, now there is temporal lobe. Temporal lobe is nothing but it contains primary auditory cortex, and it also contains auditory association area, which helps us to make the meaning of most of the audio information which we receive through our ears. Okay, and this temporal lobe, see, this is related to audio. Whatever we hear is processed in a way that we can learn the language. Okay, so that is why temporal lobe is also related to language. Now frontal lobe is extremely important. The most important lobes of all is the frontal lobe, because this is responsible for higher mental functions, planning, personality. Whatever the personality changes that occur since our childhood is mostly because of our frontal lobe, and the memory storage, decision making, language, these are all the functions of frontal lobe itself. Okay, that is why frontal lobe is the most important part of our brain, and it is also connected to limbic system. What is meant by limbic system we'll get to know. But before that, there are something called association areas of the cortex, which is nothing but the first one is Broca's association area, and the second one is Wernicke's association area. Now, Broca's, it is present in left frontal lobe. It is responsible for speech. Okay, please remember Broca's association area is mostly responsible for speech. Now, whenever a damage happens to this area, Broca's area, Broca's aphasia will occur. Now, what is Broca's aphasia? It is being unable to speak fluently, which means the candidate mispronounces some words or leaves out entire words in a sentence or in speech. Whereas coming to Wernicke's area, it is present in left temporal lobe. It is related to mainly understanding the meaning of words. So whenever a damage happens to this Wernicke's area, it will cause Wernicke's aphasia, which means unlike Broca's area's damage, the person will be able to speak fluently, pronounces correctly also, but he will speak the wrong words. Why? Because he cannot understand the speech of the second person in the first place. Okay, that is why Wernicke's area is mostly related to like Wernicke's area's damage will mostly cause in speaking the wrong words because of lack of comprehension in brain. Now, coming to the limbic system. See, now we are studying about brain, right? In brain there are three parts: forebrain, midbrain and hindbrain. And in forebrain we have just learned about cortex, which means the cerebral hemispheres, the four lobes and the two association areas. Now we learn about the limbic system. Limbic system is very simple. The first one in the limbic system is called the thalamus or thalamus. It usually acts as relay station. See, here the traffic constable is there, no? Similarly, it acts as a relay station for the brain. It processes incoming sensory information and sends to the part that processes respective sensory information. For suppose there is visual information. Now the visual information first goes into thalamus, and then the thalamus says, okay, your visual information and you need to go to the occipital lobe part of the brain. So this is how a thalamus will act. Okay, now there are there is one important point which is related to smell. Smell is the only sense that need not pass through thalamus. Why? Because smell directly goes from sinus cavity to olfactory bulbs in the brain. There are olfactory bulbs which are very near to the nose, and this sinus cavity is directly connected to the olfactory bulbs. So that is why smell does not go through thalamus. Okay. Now the second part is called hypothalamus. Hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system. What is meant by autonomic nervous system? We will learn further in uh, further course. Okay. Now it usually regulates thirst, hunger, and sleep. Also controls body temperature, sexual activity, and emotions. See, mostly hypothalamus regulates the inner, whatever the inner homeostasis is required for human beings. It is mostly controlled by hypothalamus, and mainly very important, this point is extremely important, many times asked in entrance examinations. It controls pituitary gland also, which is the master gland, and this gland controls many other hormone, like it regulates many other hormones. So hypothalamus is indirectly related to hormone regulation as well. Okay. Now the hippocampus. Hippocampus is a seahorse shaped part of the brain, mainly extremely important for long term permanent declarative memories. So what do you mean by declarative memories? Declarative memories are nothing but facts and events that can be expressed verbally. These are called declarative memories. For suppose, what is your name? Okay, my name is so and so. Where is Taj Mahal located? It is located there. These are all declarative, memories. But whereas there is something called procedural memory. How to ride a bicycle, how to write with pen. These are all called procedural memories, which cannot be expressed verbally. Okay. That is the difference between declarative and procedural memory, and the hippocampus is mostly responsible for long-term permanent declarative memories. Now, there is the last part, amygdala, which is mainly responsible for fear responses. And whenever there is a fight or flight situation in our real life, the first part of the brain which gets aroused is called amygdala. Okay, this is the most important for fight or flight responses, and amygdala also plays a key role in emotional memories. Okay. Now see, we have studied forebrain. What we need to study? Forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain, right? We have studied forebrain, which is nothing but a combination of cerebral hemispheres and the association areas and limbic system. Okay. In limbic system there are different parts, and we have studied that. Now coming to midbrain. So midbrain is the combination of medulla, pons, medulla oblongata, that is medulla, pons, reticular formation, and cerebellum. Here you can see there is medulla oblongata, and here is the pons, and reticular formation is somewhere here, and cerebellum. Okay. Now medulla is mostly responsible for life sustaining functions. Okay, which are nothing but heartbeat, breathing, swallowing, etc. See, the reason I kept an X here is because I want to imply a junction where sensory nerves come from left and right of body and cross over here. See, I have already told you like that right hemisphere is responsible for left side actions of the body, whereas the left hemisphere is responsible for the right side actions of the body. So here it is at this part, it is at this medulla oblongata that sensory nerves come from left and right of body and cross over here, like info from left of body goes to the right of the brain and vice versa. Okay. Now there is something called pons. Here also the same junction is there, but here in medulla it happens for sensory nerves, whereas in pons it happens for motor nerves. Okay, this is the most important, and it also acts as a bridge between cerebellum and upper sections of the brain. Upper sections are nothing but the cortex, and it is also responsible in sleep, dreaming, and arousal. Now there is something called reticular formation in our brain, which is nothing but network of neurons running through the middle of the medulla and pons. The reason I have kept fan here is there are general stimulus in our daily life, like the fan sound or the traffic on outside of our windows, and the barking of dogs, etc. See, this part of the brain is usually responsible for people's ability to generally attain certain kind of information from surroundings, which means it mainly helps us in selective attention, which means it helps us to ignore the constant unchanging info. Example, fan sound, or whatever the examples that I have explained just now. And helps people to be alert and aroused. Now coming to cerebellum, whatever our movements are there, they are mainly related to cerebellum. Here you can see the woman is dancing is because of the cerebellum part of the brain. See, it controls and coordinates involuntary, rapid and fine motor movements. Also coordinates voluntary movements that have to happen in rapid succession. Example, walking, dancing, skating, swimming, etc. Reflexes, skills and habits are also stored here. Okay. So these are the part of midbrain. Okay. Now coming to cerebral hemispheres. So there is something called leftists and rightists um, in neuropsychology field, which is nothing but a person whose left cerebral hemisphere is more dominated has a structuralist approach, which means he breaks down a bigger problem into components, whereas a person whose right hemisphere of the brain is more dominant usually have a gestalt approach, which means he approaches the problem as a whole. Okay. The left part of the brain is mostly related to language and speech, handwriting, calculation, sense of time, rhythms, etc. And whereas the hemisphere of the brain is usually responsible for perception, visualization, recognition of patterns, faces, emotion, melodies. Like whenever we have to recognize something as a whole, the right part of the brain helps us to do so. But whenever there are certain tasks or thoughts which requires analysis and breaking down into different components, the left part of the brain that is responsible for our actions. Okay. Now the the right hemisphere of the brain is also responsible for the expression of emotions. Okay. Now there are few important points related to brain, which is the first one, basal ganglia. It is a part of forebrain, influence motor control and learning of motor skills. This is like a minorly important part. Okay. Now the second thing is Kluver-Bucy syndrome. When the amygdala is removed, the organisms like there are certain studies in which the amygdala is deliberately removed from rats and rabbits, and then those organisms showed no fear to otherwise fear-provoking stimulus. Okay, like when the amygdala is not removed from a rat, it showed fear response to snakes, etc. But when the amygdala is removed, and then when it is present in snake is presented before the rat, it showed no fear. Okay. Now there is something called spatial neglect. Person with damage to the right parietal and occipital lobes of the cortex will ignore everything in the left visual field and vice versa. This is also one of the condition in which if the damage happens to a hemisphere, it, it leads to control the other side of the portions of our visual field. Okay. Now and there is this important point related to language, which is nothing but language is confined in about 90% population in left hemisphere only. So whatever the necessary processes that has to happen in brain which are related to language will happen in the left hemisphere in 90% of the population. Okay. Right. Now we have studied in detail about brain, right? Now we're coming to spinal cord. Spinal cord is nothing but long bundle of neurons that carries messages between the body and the brain. Okay. There are two sections in spinal cord. There is one lighter outer section and the darker inner section. The lighter outer section is because myelinated axons and nerves. Okay. And this lighter outer section carry messages from body to brain and vice versa. See, body to brain and brain to body. Whereas the darker inner section acts as a primitive sort of brain itself, and it is usually made up of cell bodies of neurons, which is why it is darker in appearance, and it is mainly responsible for reflexes. Okay, whether it is knee jerk reflex and all we have learned in earlier subjects in school. So this part of the spinal cord is mostly responsible for reflexes. Okay. Now in spinal cord there are three basic types of neurons: afferent, sensory. Like there are sensory neurons which carries information from sense organs or sensors to spinal cord, like eyes, ears, nose, touch, smell, and temper. Like whatever those senses, these sensory nerves carry the information from senses to spinal cord, whereas the motor neurons carry information from spinal cord to the muscles or glands, and then there are interneurons which connects both of them. Okay, right. Okay, so now we are going to study about the methods for studying specific regions of brain. Now, there are three types of studies: listening studies, brain stimulation, and neuroimaging. Now, what are listening studies? These studies include inserting a thin insulated electrode into the brain through which an electrical current is sent. So, at the tip of the wire, whatever the brain part is there, that brain part will be damaged. Okay, it destroys those brain cells, and this leads to permanent damage in the organism. So, listening studies are mostly uh, happens in rats, rabbits, and other organisms. Now, coming to brain stimulation techniques. In brain stimulation techniques, there are two types: invasive and non-invasive. Okay, invasive techniques are nothing but if in, uh, the stimulation happens from inside. Okay, now there is one technique called deep brain stimulation, which is nothing but electrodes are placed in specific deep brain areas and then route the electrode wire to a generator. This generator sends impulses to implanted electrodes, stimulating the specific brain areas of interest. So this is the main working principle behind deep brain stimulation method. This is generally used in treating Parkinson's disease, seizure disorders, chronic pain, depression, OCDs, and etc. There is a second invasive technique which is nothing but optogenetics. So here we used a generator and an electric current for that impulse generation, right? Here we use light rather than electricity. That's it. That is the only difference, and remaining the process and working principles are all are same. Okay, now there are non-invasive techniques. Non-invasive techniques are nothing but the brain is stimulated from the outside. So the first method is transcranial magnetic stimulation. So in the name itself it is saying it uses magnetic pulses are applied to the cortex outer areas. So how? Using special copper wire coils positioned overhead. These magnetic fields stimulate neurons in the targeted area of the cortex. So this is the working principle behind TMS. Now there is a slight variant of transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is nothing but transcranial direct current stimulation, which uses scalp electrodes to pass very low amplitude direct current to the brain to change the excitability of cortical neurons directly below the electrodes, which means wherever the electrodes are placed on the brain, the exact portions below those electrodes uh, will be excited into different state. So these the, so this is not same as electroconvulsive therapy, which uses much higher levels of current through the entire brain. Now this is one note which is common for almost all the techniques, which is nothing but stimulation in one area could disrupt or affect other areas of the brain also. Okay, now the third category of methods for studying the brain are called neuroimaging techniques. In neuroimaging techniques, there are two types: mapping structure and mapping function. Mapping structure is nothing but all about spatial resolution, which is nothing but to look at the details of the brain in much look at the orientation of brain in much more detail. Okay, the first method is CT scan. We might have heard in this hospitals and all. It uses computer controlled x-rays of the brain. Okay, map slices of the brain by computer, like it divides the brain into different layers and gives us the images. Okay, this is usually used for emergency purposes, like if there are any accidents or if there are any injuries happened, like then this CT scan method is used for emergency purposes. It shows any stroke damage, tumors, injuries and abnormal brain structures, and it is not very much detailed. Okay, it is doesn't show very small details within brain. Okay, now the second mapping structure technique is magnetic resonance imaging, which is nothing but MRI. So it coordinates and places hydrogen atoms into the gaps. It is mainly about, it uses magnetic field, radiation magnetic field, to place these hydrogen atoms into the gaps of human brain. So this gives us a very detailed image of the human brain. Now there is one more technique in mapping structure, which is nothing but MRI spectroscopy, which is similar to MRI, but it can allow to estimate the concentration of specific chemicals and neurotransmitters in brain. For suppose a person is doing some activity, so whether it is releasing dopamine, whether it is releasing serotonin, we can get to know using this type of technique. Now in mapping structure, the last technique is diffusion tensor imaging, in which they use MRI technology to provide a way to measure connectivity in brain by imaging white matter tracts. So we studied about these white matter tracts when we were studying about neurons. So DTI uses technology to form a map of these white matter tracts, so that the brain can be studied in detail. Okay, these are mostly used to measure learning and disorders like these are also used in disorders like Alzheimer's, traumatic brain injury, etc. Now coming to mapping function, which is nothing but temporal resolution is nothing but related to time. So at what times the function is in which condition. Okay, now the first one is electroencephalography, EEG. It is nothing but recording of the electrical activity of a large groups of cortical neurons just below the skull. Most often it is used, this happens using scalp electrodes. Now this EEG mainly helps determine which areas of the brain are active during various activities. Okay, this is very simple method. Now coming into a little bit variant of EEG, which is nothing but MEG, magnetoencephalography, which is much more detailed than EEG, detects small magnetic fields also, which are generated by electrical activity of neurons. Okay, now positron emission tomography, which is nothing but a radioactive sugar. This is the main point in this technique. A radioactive sugar is injected into the subject, and a computer compiles a color coded image of the activity. Makes use of indicators like energy consumption or changes in blood oxygen levels. For suppose when you are performing a mentally demanding task such as problem solving or decision making, so which part of the brain is most activated in that activity? Frontal lobe. So using PET we can get to know that the blood oxygen levels in frontal lobe are higher than any other part of the brain. So in that way we can get to know that in certain activity, if it is problem solving, okay, we are using frontal lobe more than any other part of the brain. So frontal lobe is responsible for those kind of cognitive activities. Okay, now similarly this is one more variant, which is nothing but SPECT, single photon emission uh, chromatotomography, which uses more radioactive tracers rather than radioactive sugar. Okay, now there is something called functional MRI, in which the difference between traditional and functional MRI is nothing but traditional MRI shows only structure, whereas functional MRI tracks changes in the oxygen levels of the blood in the brain. Okay, now the last one in the mapping function technique is near infrared spectroscopy, NIRS. It relies on blood oxygen. Similarly, see in positron emission tomography, similarly in NIRS also it relies on blood oxygen, but it uses near infrared light to measure cortical changes. It measures concentration of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood in the brain, limited only to a couple of centimeters depth from cortical surface. Okay, so the main difference between NIRS and PET is nothing but it uses radioactive sugar, whereas this uses near infrared light, and it also measures concentration of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood in the brain. So these are all the methods to studying specific regions of brain. Now, coming to peripheral nervous system. Now, in the peripheral nervous system, the first classification is autonomic nervous system. Okay. Now, autonomic nervous system is nothing but clumps of neurons located on or near the spinal cord. Mainly, it controls. See, autonomic in the name itself, it says it controls involuntary muscles, organs, glands, etc. Now, in which there are two classifications again, which is nothing but sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. Now, what is sympathetic nervous system? Whenever there is a fight or flight situation arises, for suppose, if you see a lion or snake on your way, that is a fight or flight situation, and it needs arousal to our body. So, at this particular point of time, it is in sympathetic nervous system which prepares us for fight or flight. So, this nervous system is mainly located middle of the spinal column, near the top of ribcage to waist area. The location is not that mandatory, but the main function is very much important. Now, obviously, there is a gland called adrenal gland, which we will get to know when we study about endocrine system. This sympathetic nervous system controls this adrenal gland, which in turn will help in our fight or flight response. Similarly, parasympathetic nervous system is just the opposite of the sympathetic. Uh, Whenever that fight or flight situation uh, is completed, then this parasympathetic nervous system gets activated to relax the body to bring back to the balance. It is located on top and bottom of the spinal column on either side of sympathetic division neurons. Okay, again, location is not that mandatory, but the function is more important. And it returns the body to normal functioning after a stressful situation ends. This is just about autonomic nervous system. Very simple. Now coming to somatic nervous system. Now, in somatic nervous system, there are two types. One is sensory pathway and the second one is motor pathway. Sensory pathway is nothing but it consists of afferent nerves, which means it carries messages from senses to central nervous system. Whereas in motor pathways, the EFF, efferent nerves, carries messages from CNS to voluntary or skeletal muscles of the body. So we can remember like this: efferent, the nerves which start with A can be remembered as axis. The nerves which start with E, efferent, can be remembered with exit. Okay, so these are motor nerves, these are sensory nerves. This is all about peripheral nervous system. Very simple. Okay, the peripheral nervous system is done. Now coming to endocrine system. Before studying endocrine system, we should learn about glands. The glands are nothing but the organs that secrete chemicals called hormones. Okay, these hormones release their chemicals directly on the body's tissues through ducts. Example, salivary glands. For suppose, uh, these salivary gland, when it releases saliva into our mouth, these hormones does not affect behavior directly. For example, saliva. Whenever the saliva gets released, it does not affect our behavior directly, as seen to the naked eye. For so, and at the same time, some glands have no ducts. They release chemicals directly into our bloodstream. These glands are called endocrine glands, and these chemicals, which are nothing but called hormones released by these endocrine glands, will affect our behavior directly. Very, very important. Okay. Now, these hormones have molecules. Whatever the hormones that are being released by endocrine glands, these have molecules that fit into the receptor sites of target organs. And this endocrine communication is slower than the synaptic communication. Synaptic communication is, which is nothing but the communication that takes place between the neurons. Okay, but this endocrine communication is much slower. Why? Because they have to travel through bloodstream. Okay. Now these hormones affect behavior and emotions by stimulating muscles, organs, and other glands of the body. And in endocrine system, there are different glands which each releases one or multiple hormones, which in turn affects our behavior. Now let's see one by one. First one is pituitary gland. It is located just below the brain, connected to hypothalamus. as we have already studied, hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, right? Now, pituitary gland is also called as master gland because it controls all the other glands, and it secretes multiple hormones as well. The first one of which is growth hormones, which regulate size of the body from infancy and childhood, and it also stimulates ovaries and testes, which affect development and functioning of reproductive organs as well. And there is, and also not only it affects the functioning of reproductive organs, and it also helps in developing the secondary sex characteristics, which is nothing but whether it is voice, whether it is pubic hair, and etc. Okay, and it also helps in release of oxytocin, which is a vital hormone in the time of pregnancy for the milk letdown reflex, like uh, yeah. And the second thing is vasopressin, which controls the levels of water in our human body. So these are not complete list of pituitary glands functions. These are the just an overview. Now the second gland is pineal gland. It regulates biological rhythms of our body. It secretes melatonin hormone, through which we get to know the day length and seasons. This melatonin hormone is mainly related to sleep and wake cycle. Okay. Now coming to thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is also related to growth and metabolism. Mainly it releases thyroxine. Pancreas. Pancreas regulate blood sugar in body. Okay. Whenever pancreas name pops up, you should get reminded of the blood sugar. Now it secretes insulin and glucagon. These two hormones are responsible for blood sugar regulation in our body. How? We'll see. For suppose, insulin converts glucose to glycogen. Whenever you consume something, for suppose if you consume rice, and rice contains glucose, this insulin converts glucose to glycogen and thereby reducing the blood sugar level in your body. And for suppose whenever that blood sugar level falls down, this glucagon hormone converts this glycogen into glucose again, and thereby increasing the blood sugar level in the body. So this is why pancreas is very much important in regulating uh, bodily sugars. Okay, for suppose the insulin secretion is too low, it will cause diabetes. Okay, for suppose the insulin secretion is too high, it will cause hypoglycemia or glycemia. Now there is adrenal glands. Adrenal glands we have already discussed above, that these are mainly responsible in fight and flight response. So there are two adrenal glands on each kidney. Each gland has two sections, adrenal medulla and adrenal cortex. The adrenal medulla mainly releases epinephrine and norepinephrine, responsible for sympathetic arousal. Sympathetic arousal, which means what? Whenever there is a fight or flight response situation occurs, this sympathetic arousal is necessary. Okay. So this is taken care by adrenal medulla. Now coming to adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex releases cortisol. In the time of physical or psychological stress, releases glucose into bloodstream, and it also releases fatty acids from fat cells to muscle. So these are all the most important functions of adrenal glands. So these are some of the glands in the endocrine system. Yeah, thank you.